Imagine you've just taken one of the most fortified cities in the East. But before you can celebrate, a Muslim relief army arrives and locks you in from the outside. If you hunker down, your men will starve to death. If you throw open the gates and fight head-on, your exhausted army will barely stand a chance. What do you do? That was the situation the Crusaders faced at Antioch. In the year 1098, after months of siege, they had finally forced their way into the city. But Antioch itself had become the trap. Inside was a starving, broken army, spent and nearly out of everything that mattered. Outside was the Muslim relief force, poised to crush the Crusaders the moment they dared step through the gates. Did the Crusaders hold their ground, or gamble everything on a breakout? And what happens when a hard-won victory turns into a death trap? To understand why Antioch became one of the defining moments of the First Crusade, you have to see it for what it was, a door that could not be left shut. In 1097, the Crusaders had made the long crossing from Europe to the East. They carried their vow to reach Jerusalem, but between that religious dream and reality stood a hard fact. To push south into Syria and Palestine, they had to go through Antioch. Antioch was not some minor waypoint. It was an ancient, sprawling city, sitting astride the main artery connecting Anatolia to the Near East. If the Crusaders bypassed it and pressed on toward Jerusalem, they would leave behind a powerful stronghold capable of threatening their supply lines, their communications, and any hope of retreat. To put it plainly, Antioch wasn't just blocking the road ahead, it could become a knife at their backs. But taking Antioch was an enormous challenge. The city was protected by long walls, rugged terrain, mountain ridges, fortified gates, and a defensive network capable of breaking any attacking force. Even for a fresh army, Antioch would have been brutally difficult. For the Crusaders, worn down by months of marching, it was something closer to suicidal. They did not arrive at Antioch intact. The army had been ground down by the road itself. Hunger, disease, weather, corpses, and relentless skirmishing. Among their ranks were nobles, knights, infantry, clergy, and pilgrims, bound by the same destination, but not always by the same plan for reaching it. So what were their options? Push on, and risk being struck from behind, or stop to besiege the city, and accept a war of attrition they might not survive. They stopped. From that moment, Antioch was no longer just a military objective. It became a test of endurance for the entire expedition. Faith might carry them to the walls, but faith doesn't turn into rations or fighting strength. Courage might sustain them, but it can't replace dead horses, sick men, or empty storehouses. The siege of Antioch did not begin with a glorious charge. It began with being stuck. The Crusaders were forced to stand before a city too large to bypass and too strong to take quickly. And it was here, before victory had turned into a trap, that Antioch began grinding them down, one day at a time. The siege of Antioch was not a quick battle. It was a drawn-out war of attrition, one where the Crusaders' worst enemies were not the defenders inside the walls, but hunger, disease, and time itself. By the time they arrived at Antioch, they had already come too far. The men who had left Europe vowing to reach Jerusalem now found themselves stranded before a city too big to go around and too fortified to take by storm. The core problem was that the Crusaders couldn't fully encircle Antioch. The walls were too extensive, the terrain too complex, and their forces too depleted. The siege fell into a grinding stalemate. They couldn't leave, but they couldn't end it quickly either. Day by day, food ran out. The poor went hungry first. Then even knights and nobles felt the shortage. Horses died from starvation or disease. In a medieval army, losing horses meant more than losing transport. It meant losing striking power, losing reconnaissance, and losing the central symbol of knightly status. A knight without a horse can still carry a sword, but he is no longer the weapon he once was. Then disease began spreading through the camps. Cold, rain, mud, rotting bodies of men and animals, and the slow torture of waiting, all of it broke morale. Men deserted, men lost faith, Men started questioning their leaders. And here's the critical thing. The Crusaders were not a unified bloc. Their ranks included nobles, knights, infantry, clergy, pilgrims, people who had come along for very different reasons. They shared a destination, but not always a common will for how to reach it. While the army kept moving, those tensions could stay buried. But pinned beneath the walls of Antioch, everything started cracking open. Who was responsible for supplies? Who held the authority to give orders? If they took the city, who would control it? These questions made no clash of steel, but they quietly fractured the force from within. So what kept them there? Part of it was faith, part of it was honor, part of it was having come too far to turn back. But there was also a colder logic. They couldn't abandon Antioch without putting themselves in danger. Retreat, and the crusade might collapse. Push on, and leave a powerful stronghold in their rear. Stay, and be ground down by hunger and disease. Antioch had become a grinding machine. Before the Crusaders ever took the city had already taken something from them. They were not about to enter Antioch as conquerors. They were about to enter it as survivors. After months of siege, the Crusaders finally got inside Antioch, not through a frontal assault, not through overwhelming force. They got in with help from the inside. Someone within the city's defenses secretly opened a way for them. Under cover of darkness, Crusader troops scaled the walls, seized key positions, and poured into the city. For them, that moment should have felt like release. After all those months of hunger, after watching their comrades die outside the walls, they were finally inside Antioch. The city that had blocked their road to Jerusalem was now in their hands. But this victory had arrived at the worst possible time. The Crusaders were starving, exhausted, and disorganized. They hadn't had the chance to restore order within the city. They hadn't had the chance to turn Antioch into a secure base, and the food inside wasn't nearly enough to meet what they needed. Most critically, they had no time to recover. From the east, the army of Kerboga, the Lord of Mosul, was on the march. His objective was clear: relieve Antioch and destroy the Crusaders on the spot. In a single moment, the meaning of Antioch flipped. Before, Antioch was a door that had to be opened. Now, it was about to become a room with no exit. The Crusaders thought they'd escaped the hell outside the walls, but as the gates of Antioch swung shut behind them, they realized hell had just changed address. When Kerboga's army arrived, the whole situation reversed. Before, the Crusaders had stood outside, staring in at Antioch, pressing the city to surrender. Now they stood inside, staring out, watching a massive force encircle them. Before, they were the besiegers. Now, they were the besieged. Before, Antioch was the target. Now, Antioch was the cage. This is the cruelest irony of the whole story. Victory didn't bring freedom. Victory locked them in. Inside the walls was a spent army. They needed rest, food, time. They had none of it. Rations were gone. Horses were gone. The sick were everywhere. Morale was cracking. Some men were thinking about running. Some believed God was testing them beyond all limit. Outside the walls was Kerboga's force, larger, in control, with nothing to do but wait for the Crusaders to fall apart. On the surface, Kerboga held every advantage. He didn't need to rush. The people on the outside could afford to wait. The people inside could not. And that is what made Antioch a death trap. The same walls that had seemed so terrifying when the Crusaders stood outside them. Those same walls now held them prisoner, along with the hunger and the fear. If you put yourself inside the city at that moment, the despair didn't arrive as a single blow. It came as a slow accumulation of small signs. The storerooms emptying, the soldiers weakening, rumors spreading faster than orders, the commanders arguing, and outside, the enemy was still there. One question became impossible to avoid. What had they taken Antioch for, if they were going to starve to death inside the very city they just won? In those circumstances, religious faith played an enormous role. The story of the Holy Lance, said to have been discovered buried within the city, lifted the spirits of many crusaders. Whatever one thinks of its authenticity, the psychological impact was undeniable. A starving army doesn't only need bread, they need a reason not to break. They need to believe their suffering means something. They need to believe that if they open those gates and march out, it isn't just a desperate gamble, it's a final trial they are meant to pass. But Kerboga's side was not without its own problems. His army was large, but it was a coalition, drawn from many different forces. They might all want to stop the Crusaders, but they did not necessarily share the same loyalties, the same interests, or the same depth of commitment to Kerboga himself. A large army is not always an army of one will. This is the key. Inside Antioch, the Crusaders were weak in material terms, but they had been compressed into a single objective: survive. Outside Antioch, Kerboga's force was numerically superior, but cracks were running through the coalition beneath the surface. So who actually held the stronger hand? The answer wasn't on any map. It lived in endurance, in morale, and in the decision each side was about to make. In theory, holding the walls made obvious sense. The Crusaders had just taken one of the most fortified cities in the region. They had walls, gates, towers, and defensive positions. When you're weaker, the natural instinct is to stay behind stone and avoid a direct engagement with a larger force. But a city is only a fortress when what's inside it includes food, order, and the will to fight. Without those things, it's a prison. Holding meant extending the siege, and extending the siege meant more hunger, more disease, lower morale. Every day that passed, the Crusaders weren't getting stronger, they were getting weaker. They could hope Kerboga would tire and pull back, but that hope was dangerously thin. The people on the outside could afford to wait. The people inside could not. They could also hope that Byzantine forces or another Christian army might come to relieve them, but counting on rescue is not a plan. And if they waited until the last man was too weak to stand, opening the gates wouldn't save anyone. So holding looked cautious, but in practice, it was just a slower way to die. The other option was to break out, open the gates, send the army out, fight the besieging force head-on. This was an extraordinarily risky call. If they lost, they wouldn't just lose Antioch, they could lose the entire First Crusade. Everything they had endured from Europe to Anatolia to Syria might end right here, at the foot of these walls. But precisely because the stakes were that high, the choice had its own logic. When you can't win with time, you have to win in a single moment. When you can't survive long inside the walls, you have to move before your last reserves vanish. When you can't wait for your enemy to leave on his own, you have to hit hard enough to shake the whole coalition apart. Here's the point. The Crusaders didn't choose to attack because it was safe. They chose to attack because holding on was just a slower death. Sometimes in war, the boldest decision doesn't come from supreme confidence. It comes from having no good options left. An army with choices can afford to wait. An army locked inside a city, starving, watching death creep closer every day, reads risk differently. For them, opening those gates was no longer just reckless. It was the last chance to turn the trap into a battlefield. And they opened the gates. When the Crusaders marched out of Antioch, their greatest strength was not their numbers. Their greatest strength was that they had one single objective. They weren't marching out to grab more territory, to parade their honor, or to win a glorious battle. They were marching out because if they didn't break the siege, they would die. That objective was simple, clear, and carried enormous weight. What mattered is that despite their starvation and exhaustion, they held their formation. If a mob of spent men had surged out in chaos, Kerboga's army would have cut them down quickly. But if they could hold their ranks, take orders, advance together toward a shared goal, then their desperation became a directed force. On the other side, Kerboga had the larger force, but he needed to turn that force into a unified response. That was no easy thing, because his army was a coalition of many different contingents, each with its own interests and its own degree of loyalty to him. A large army is not always an army of one mind. The Crusaders didn't need to destroy Kerboga's entire force. They needed to break his rhythm. And when a large army starts to waver, its numerical superiority can become a burden rather than an asset. On a medieval battlefield, orders don't travel as fast as fear. A hesitant flank can make another flank believe the battle is already lost. A single retreating unit can read, from a distance, as a sign of collapse. When cohesion slips, a force that seemed overwhelming can come apart with startling speed. The Crusader victory at Antioch should not, therefore, be understood simply as a miracle disconnected from reality. It was the product of desperation, discipline, religious conviction, the right decision at the right moment, and the fractures already running through the opposing coalition. Kerboga could besiege Antioch, but he could not force his entire coalition to share one will, and in the decisive moment, that became his undoing. The Crusaders broke through. The army that had seemed on the verge of dying inside the city fought its way out and survived. But surviving didn't mean every problem was over. The immediate result was clear. The Crusaders had survived. Had they been wiped out at Antioch, the First Crusade might have ended before it ever reached Jerusalem. Every vow, every sermon, every month of marching, every death along the way, all of it might have been buried in an exhausted city in northern Syria. But they weren't buried there. After breaking the siege, their morale recovered, not because every hardship had vanished, but because they had come through a moment that many believed was unsurvivable. Antioch became proof that the expedition was still alive. The road toward Jerusalem was open again. But the long-term consequences were more complicated. Antioch was not just a city that had been taken, it was a strategic position, a center of power, and a prize too significant to set aside. Whoever controlled Antioch had a powerful foothold in the east, and when a victory carries that kind of weight, disputes between leaders are almost inevitable. The problem ran deeper because of the Byzantine connection. Antioch had once been part of the Byzantine world, which meant, in theory, the city was not simply a trophy for whoever wanted to keep it, but the reality on the ground was different. Bohemond, who had played a crucial role in taking Antioch, wanted to keep it for himself. For him, Antioch wasn't just a religious victory, it was the chance to build his own power base. From this point, another dimension of the crusade began to surface. In the beginning, it was told as a sacred journey toward Jerusalem, but along the road, every city taken, every stretch of land controlled, every hard-won battle raised a very earthly question: who would rule? Antioch was therefore a turning point on multiple levels. It kept the crusade from collapsing, but it also pulled the crusade deeper into the politics of power. From here, the Crusaders were no longer just a force passing through the east. They were putting down roots, holding territory, building bases, and turning military victories into lasting control. For Jerusalem, Antioch was a launchpad. For Bohemond, it was a prize. For Byzantium, it was a grievance. And for the Muslim world of the region, it was a signal. These people from the west were not just passing through, they might stay. Antioch, then, was not just a military victory. It was the moment the crusade shifted from an arduous march into a project of building power in the east. At Antioch, the Crusaders ultimately chose not to hold out to the bitter end. They opened the gates. They sent a starving, exhausted army, pushed to its absolute limit, out to fight a decisive battle. That was not the safe choice, and it was not a choice born of absolute confidence. It was the choice of men who understood that if they kept waiting, they would die slowly inside the very city they had just taken. Antioch reveals one of the coldest paradoxes of medieval warfare. Some victories do not bring immediate relief. Some doors, once opened, do not lead to freedom. They lead into a deeper trap. For the Crusaders, the moment they stepped inside Antioch was not the end of their ordeal. It was the beginning of an even harder test. Locked inside the walls, out of food, out of time, staring down a large army waiting just outside. But in that situation, they had no other move except to turn their desperation into action. Hold on, and they'd lose their strength day by day. Surrender, and they'd lose everything. Fight their way out, and they might die at the gates. But only that last option left any chance of survival. And they took it. The victory at Antioch didn't just save the First Crusade from destruction. It changed what the Crusade actually was. From here, The Crusaders were no longer simply passing through the east on the way to Jerusalem. They were claiming land, building power, and leaving behind contradictions that would echo for generations. Antioch reminds us that in history, capturing a great city is not always the ending. Sometimes, that's exactly when the trap finally closes.